Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm Pete Oliver. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at DAZN, and we're delighted to welcome you to our global headquarters today for this event. I'm just going to take a few moments to tell you a little bit about us and how we're growing audiences for women's sport around the world. So, some of you may know a bit about DAZN already. You may know we're the home of the Women's Champions League. If you live here in the UK, you probably think of us as a boxing service, but actually we're one of the largest sports broadcasters in the world. We have over 20 million subscribers, and if I could just take you on a quick tour of our countries, we are the market leader in Italy, where we have all of the Serie A football. We're the market leader in Spain, where we have La Liga, Formula One and MotoGP. And we are one of the market leaders in Germany, where we have the Bundesliga and the Champions League. Similar positions in Belgium and Portugal. We are the leader in Japan, Taiwan, and we have a great service in Canada. So we're a very, very significant European international sports business. And we've used that platform to significantly grow viewing for women's sport. We've invested very heavily in women's football. We've been the home of the Women's Champions League now since 2021. We are the broadcaster for La Liga Femenina from Spain, Frauen Bundesliga, the WE League in Japan, and many, many other women's leagues, which we're making available on our global platform to over 200 countries and markets around the world. Because we're a digital business, we're doing more than just broadcasting the live content. We have all of the usual highlights, magazine shows you would expect, but we've made a very big investment in our social media channels. And we're also bringing together a broader range of services, whether that be social media experiences for customers on our platform, the ability to chat with other fans, place a bet, buy a ticket, or even buy merchandise for your favorite team. So that's a little bit about our business and how we're set up. I wanted to take just a moment to briefly reflect on two really big moments for us over the last 18 months around women's sport. And these were two really big breakthrough moments we felt in terms of how we've developed the audience. The first is if I take you back to March last year, Madison Square Garden in New York, Katie Taylor became the first female boxer to headline at that iconic venue. And Taylor Serrano was one of the biggest fights of that year. It had the highest ever viewing for a women's boxing competition, boxing match, and it was in our top 3 events in boxing for that year. And since then, Katie Taylor has gone on to continue to bring in huge audiences for us and really is one of the superstars of our service. And a bit more recently, if I take you to the end of this season, the Women's Champions League has continued to grow and go from strength to strength. We took on the rights in 2021. We made the decision to make the content free, to make the games free on YouTube, and that's really worked in terms of growing the audience. And this year's final achieved a record audience of over 5 million people watching Barcelona lift that trophy. So we're really pleased with our partnership with UEFA. So that's a little bit about us. We're really excited about this morning, and I'll hand back to Harriet to get things going.
Thanks very much, Pete, and thank you to DAZN. It's great to be partnering with you to put on this fantastic event this morning. I am Harriet Leach, Legal Director at Onside Law, and I genuinely want to wish each and every one of you a very warm welcome to this morning's event. And I hope you're ready, because we've got a fantastic discussion ahead of us. Look, women's sport is skyrocketing. Momentum is truly building, and we're seeing real growth in terms of the numbers, whether that be increased viewerships, increased audiences in stadia, whether that be higher value sponsorship deals and media rights deals, whether that be higher player transfer fees and salaries, and indeed at grassroots level, there's more girls and women playing sport than ever before, which is fantastic news. At Onside Law, our women's sport practice is growing, and we're working with clients like FIFA on their hosting project for the Women's World Cup. We're acting for national governing bodies that are in the process of professionalising their sport. We're acting for players like Caroline Weir on her transfer from Manchester City Women to Real Madrid last summer. And we're acting for many clubs that are involved in elite competition like Lewes, London City Lionesses, West Ham, Gloucester, Hartpury in rugby. But being immersed in women's sport like we are, I can see that it's actually quite a fragile ecosystem at time. It requires resource, it requires infrastructure, and there's key decisions that are being made, not least by these brilliant people to my left, regarding the ownership of competitions, regarding who should partake in the competitions, the governance, where the rights should sit, how we split sporting and regulatory matters, and so on and so on. So with that in mind, this is a women's sport event, but I don't really want to be talking about what colour kit the girls should be playing in. Not that that's not important, of course it is. We're not going to be talking about maternity rights or maternity policies, not because it's important, but because these brilliant people here have got real experience of launching and growing and developing their elite competitions and leagues. So we're going to be focusing on that and then looking at how brands can turbocharge leagues' success through the likes of Snap. So I'll quickly introduce the panel. To my left is Anmol from Snap. He is the head of sports partnerships there. We've got Kelly Simmons, OBE, who up until very, very, very recently was the director of the professional women's game at the FA, but is still heavily involved at the FA and is taking a leading role with Karen Carney on the independent review into women's football. Next to Kelly is Belinda Moore, who is the CEO of Premiership Women's Rugby, the new competition for women's rugby that starts next season. And following on from Belinda is Beth Barrett-Wild from the ECB, and she's the director of the professional women's game at the ECB for cricket. So we're going to get into a discussion shortly for about 50 minutes. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end, so please do save those up, and we'll get a mic out to the floor for a couple of questions before we head back into networking. And that's the final thing I would say. I mean, look around this room. We've got some incredible people, key personnel from rights holders, investors, clubs, founders, athletes themselves, and agencies. And you're all here because you either work in women's sport or you're interested in getting involved or learn more about women's sport. And so I feel like we have a platform, we have a voice. I'd encourage you to connect with one another, to innovate, to encourage and to challenge, and let's continue the conversations afterwards. Okay, well, let's get started. And I'd like to turn first to women's rugby, because that is going through a real period of change, exciting change. For those that haven't been following it closely, 10 clubs have been selected to take part in the Premiership Women's Rugby League from next season, 24-25. And the league is going to move into a co-owned model with the RFU and certain clubs. So with that in mind, Belinda, what's keeping you busy? What stage are you at? And also I'm interested to know what's it like being the CEO of a new organisation that's co-owned by clubs and the governing body, the RFU?
I think taking the first one first, where are we now? We're getting there, is the answer. I think if I had any advice for anyone doing this again, leave about twice as much time for the legal and governance. But I think we are almost there. But it's been quite an interesting challenge, because obviously I'm very lucky. So it is a start-up, but it isn't a start-up. So the league's existed for the last 6 years. The RFU ran Premier 15s primarily as a pathway for the national team, for the Red Roses. And then they spent the last year working with Porters, looking at what was the next step, what was the evolution of this. And they decided after a lot of modelling that the answer was to take it out of the RFU, set up as a new co, which is, as you say, joint owned by the RFU and the clubs themselves. And that gives us a huge opportunity to sort of not reset the game, but to start a new chapter in it. There's some really serious investment behind it now, which we haven't had in the past, which will make a big difference to how things start to look and feel. It'll take a couple of seasons, I think, for that to come through, but I think our big sort of laddering up is to 2025 when we have the Rugby World Cup in England. We know that's going to be a huge opportunity and a huge moment for the sport. It'll get that sort of coverage that women's rugby doesn't quite get yet outside of the Six Nations. So I think there's just a lot going on to get us over the line as a business. But it's been interesting because it's literally been everything from building a team to opening a bank account, which is harder than you'd think. You'd be surprised. To doing the rebrand last week, and I haven't even done 6 months in the job yet. So, it's been busy.
No, we know the the woes of opening bank accounts. We get asked that quite a lot. So, in terms of that period of time, then, as you say, you would have given yourself more time. What sort of would be that right length of time, do you think, if you could go back? Because we do work with, and people are asking the questions as to sort of how long should the process be? Would you give yourself a good year or two?
Yeah, I mean, how long is a piece of string is the honest answer to that. I think the challenge has been that the RFU have never done something like this. I had owned a competition and taken it outside in this way. So I think all of this is new territory. So we've argued about lots of silly, small things, and actually some of the big stuff has actually been easier to fix. Yeah. So would I, if I was doing it again, I'd probably give us another 6 months, probably a year, just to take the pressure down a bit. At the minute, there's quite a lot going on, trying to get a lot done in a short space of time. It's taken up a lot of focus when we have all the rest of the season set up to do as well.
Exactly. You're about to end season. Kelly, I'm going to come to you next, because women's football is sort of going into a similar model to the one we've just heard Belinda articulate for women's rugby. Again, for those that have missed this, so the top two leagues, the Barclays WSL and the Barclays Women's Championship, is being spun out of the FA into a new company. We're expecting that to be co-owned by the 24 clubs as soon as next season. As the FA is sort of almost about to hand over the reins of the competitions that you and your team have built so successfully over recent years, one of the things that I often think about is that there'll be a golden share model we're expecting, where the FA will retain certain rights over the running of that model. Is that similar to the EPL? How do you identify those treasures that you want to protect? Are there any nuances or differences with golden shares as they operate with women's sport, do you think?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's still to be finalised, the golden share, and it's been in discussions for some time. I was chuckling at how long it takes to come out. So we started with the golden share in the men's game as a sort of a basis with, really it's sort of a right of veto. So I've only ever heard it used or even spoken about in the men's game once, when there was talk about no relegation during COVID, and I heard our chairman at the time go, golden share, we'll use our golden share, you will relegate. And that finished that debate quite quickly, but it's sort of, it means the FA have got a veto over sort of changes to sort of ownership, to size of league, to promotion, relegation, etc., etc. So there's some certain things in there, and then we sat down and thought, well, history's a great for sort of learning from, isn't it? What would be the things that we think should be in the women's golden share? And these are still, some of these are still to be agreed, but we certainly thought there could be greater collaboration across the league in England, and that both really need each other to thrive, to be really successful. So how do we support that whole ecosystem around locking in a winter break? I mean, I've been at the FA for years when the men's game were arguing for years and years about winter break. Locking in things like winter break, trying to lock in some homegrown rule protections, etc., etc. And then the one that is still to be agreed, which would have transformed children's and grassroots football, would have been had there been some sort of lock-in of a rev share back from the Premier League revenues when it went out the door of the FA back into children's and grassroots football. So is there a point where the WSL and the Championship have generated significant revenues and everybody's not losing, not operating losses? Should there be some share back into young people, youth development, grassroots? So those things still need to be worked through, but they were the sorts of things that we talked about in terms of women's specific treasures on top of the baseline.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and obviously there's some way to go, there's some negotiations to have. Whereabouts are you? Are you still on target for it to be the league's club-owned from next summer? Is that the plan?
Yeah, it is. So the plan is that by sort of the latest, really, summer 24 to be club-owned. We went through a strategic review alongside the Women's Professional Games strategy. We conducted an ownership review. We very quickly came to an independent company who felt that it needed laser focus. There's some natural conflicts of it being in the governing body as well as it being sort of lost in a whole range of priorities. There were concerns about it just being rolled into the Premier League. Some of those clubs are different. And again, it goes back to the board that we want to operate and the executive structure. And doesn't mean there can't be some shared services and strategic partnerships down the line, but we want it to make decisions that are wholly based on what is best for the women's professional game. So we've gone to the recommendation on independent, new company, club-owned, and it's sort of foot to the floor to get it ready by next summer. And the final bits really are just trying to sort of agree the powers and duties of the board versus the clubs and that sort of governance piece over the next few weeks or so, but well on the road to do that. And only being able to haven't done that because we've gone from FA having to invest around sort of when I came in 2018, so the FA were investing about 7 million in the leagues, and the academies obviously it couldn't come out and operate on its own, but it's now plus 18 million of revenues, doesn't need any FA investment centrally, so it's distributing 67 million back, so it's able to come out and stand on its own 2 feet.
Yeah, okay. It's interesting, isn't it? Legal and governance is coming up, and I think that often that turns people off, right? Governance, who wants to sort of get into the weeds of that. But I think setting yourselves up correctly, making sure there is good corporate governance, and particularly where clubs are involved, whether that be as owners or as key strategic partners, then we need to understand where the rights sit and who has power and control over what matters. Anmol. I'd like to ask you, as a brand that works with leagues like the WSL, how important is the setup and the existing reach of a league when you look to partner? Or are you actually looking for untapped potential and knowing what you can bring to turbocharge, as I say, the sort of growth of a league?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think it's a little bit of both. When we first started doing this around 8 years ago, the league's prominence and obviously existing reach was very important to us because we were new, so no one knew who we were. So partnering with like the NFL and ESPN and the NBA in the US gave us credence in the space. But to your second part of your question, they were partnering with us to get untapped potential, right? So back then, there was no social media strategy. There was no digital strategy. They had a huge linear sort of presence, but they were not reaching young fans. And we got sort of lucky when we started doing this, and call it 2015. There was 2 trends happening in the space. The average age of a user on TV was high, and viewership was kind of declining for that bucket. So we could solve both problems through our kind of solutions on Snapchat. And our goal really is to help them reach the next generation of fans. So when we think about leagues, broadcasters, rights holders, teams, or athletes, right, they all have sort of the same goal, which is to keep their hardcore fans happy and excited and to reach new fans. And for us, we can kind of help them with that second piece. So I really think it depends on the partner. When we think about our space in women's sports, a lot of these new sports obviously don't have the same reach as men's sports today, but to become relevant with the young generation, platforms like Snap are really, really important. So today, in the UK, we have with DAZN, the Champions League show we have with them, which is amazing. We have a WSL show, highlight show, as well with Sky Sports, which has been incredible. It's actually featured on their broadcast as well. Last summer for the Euros, worked with BBC and had coverage of amazing England's historic win, highlights every single day. We have a show with Optus Sport that actually won an award with Sports Pro last year for the coverage of women's sports football. So we have some incredible things over there. In the US, we have WNBA, we're going to talk about later, I think, Together Sports, Just Women's Sports. And really our goal, again, is to be that platform to help them reach that next generation of fans and help them unlock that potential they're not getting today.
Fantastic. Beth, a question on commercialisation, because obviously Anmol and Snap are doing wonders to sort of reach a new audience and clearly key to the sustainability of women's sport will be the importance to drive commercial revenues, so that one hopes women's sport and the women's arm of the sport can stand on its own 2 feet. I think in cricket, I'm right in saying that a lot of the rights are still bundled, if not all of them are bundled with men's cricket. So men's cricket is still very important to the success of women's cricket. How are you seeing the commercial rights landscape changing at the ECB and within cricket? And what do you think we can do sort of to drive commercial revenues for the women's game when there's sort of increasing pressures to play in better stadiums, to have better infrastructure and resources around women athletes and teams?
Yeah, look, I think that commercial growth piece is really important. I think it's been fascinating conversation so far. Governance can be cool, by the way, Harriet. It's very important. Thanks. And I think actually even the fact that we're talking about that in a conversation about professionalising women's sport is just showing the sort of the professionalisation off the field, actually. So we've invested heavily in how we're professionalising the athletes and the players on the field, and really raising that quality of the cricket, in my respect, on the field. But how we commercialise that off the field now and set ourselves up for that long-term financial sustainability is crucial. And look, I think we're in a positive place. I think we're starting to see the real green shoots of that. So I think our 3 main sort of revenue sources traditionally are through broadcast, tickets and commercial partners. And I think our broadcast deal from the previous iteration to the next one coming in has gone up by 10x for the women's game across England women's rights and the 100. Ticket sales are flying, so we're in the middle of our Ashes series at the moment. It's got the men's and the women's Ashes alongside each other. We're seeing record-breaking crowds within the women's Ashes, which again, bringing those revenues in through those ticket sales will make a huge difference. And then commercial partners. So the majority of our deals at ECB and within cricket are bundled. I think that's a really interesting conversation, actually, around sort of some of the examples that are happening, especially in football, that we're seeing around sort of UEFA and FIFA and unbundling some of those rights. We do have a bundled proposition at the moment, and I think for us as a sport, we're very sort of clear on our ambition for cricket to be the UK's most inclusive sport, and I think one of the key parts of that is how we co-present men's and women's cricket on that shared platform. And for that, it means that a lot of our commercial partners, they want the men and the women. But I think the really key part within that actually is making sure that we're recognising the value of the women's rights within those deals now. And look, historically, that might not have been the case. I think historically, the women's game was probably thrown in as a kind of, not necessarily an afterthought, but because it was just part of the package. I think what we're seeing now with our commercial partners is real attribution of value to those women's rights and activation of those rights. And I think that's absolutely crucial, actually, is, it's all very well and good having partners on board and having the logos on the shirts, etc., but we need to see them activating in stadiums. So look, I think we're in a great place. We've actually just done our first ever standalone commercial deal for women and girls cricket. We've got a champion partner on board now in Metro Bank, which is really exciting, and that's a top to bottom, so they've got rights across the professional game, the England women's team, all the way through to the grassroots. And again, I think they're going to be a brilliant partner in terms of how they activate those rights. They're making lots of real positive noise. We've got a thing set up called The Fund, which sounds incredibly exciting, and like it's got oodles of cash in there. So we're going to look to spend that in various grassroots initiatives. I think we're looking at things like women in coaching in particular. So just trying to address some of those gaps that we've got within the sport at the moment. But I can't remember what your question was, to be honest, Harriet. I've just gone off on one there. But look, there's lots going on. We're in a really, really positive space, but I do think we're still just scratching the surface. And I think that's the key thing for me, and in terms of sort of the evolution of women's cricket and women's sport. And Belinda mentioned it there in terms of the evolution of the women's Premiership Rugby, if I got that right, rebrand-ish. Those words maybe not in the right order. Sorry.
PWR.
But the evolution of that's something that we're looking at the moment in the women's game. So I've just taken on a new role as director of women's professional game at ECB, and we're looking to write a new strategy for that next evolution of professional women's cricket in this country. The last sort of 4 or 5 years have all been about investing in the quality of the cricket, so investing in the pathways, investing in the structures, making sure that the quality of the players coming through and the quality of the product is as strong as possible. The next phase is how do we use that to really generate that audience growth, and I think we're seeing that through things like the 100 and through the Women's Ashes this summer. And then the final bit, which is the fun bit, I suppose, is how do we start realising that long-term commercial value? So once we've grown that audience, how do we then start turning that into pounds?
Really fascinating. And Beth, you talk about the strategy there. So what does that actually look like? Is that just...
I don't know yet, Harry. I'm still writing.
No, but that's the point, right? You've got this blank piece of paper, and we hear about this a lot at women's sports event. Oh, you've got a blank canvas. You can go whichever way you want. But I think that obviously women's sport to a large degree, particularly the team sports that are represented today on the panel, they are sort of integrated with men's sport. And I wonder, look, in your role, you're devising a strategy. How do you go about that? Is that sort of internal conversations? Is it talking to brands? How important are your stakeholders and the participation counties and clubs?
Yeah, look, it's a huge stakeholder piece. And I think it's one of the things, actually, when we talk about women's sport, and in a positive way, people think that there is a blank piece of paper and that you can be innovative and you can do different things. And look, you can to an extent. In cricket, we do have, it's a very traditional sport. It has got a very long-standing governance structure in the men's game. And it does mean that there are elements that are actually quite prescriptive with what we can do or what we choose to do. So look, I think there are some really exciting examples out there. So the likes of, I think in US sport in particular, actually, with sort of Angel City and brands like that. Angel City is fascinating. It's almost like a media and entertainment brand that plays football, which I think is really interesting. I think the way that sport is set up in this country and in this market is a bit different. And I think I don't know, I can't speak for Belinda and Kelly, but like we have, it's not a completely blank piece of paper, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think what we're seeing, especially in cricket, and one of our like key parts within the strategy actually is how do we almost use the existing scale of the men's game, not see it as a threat or something that we need to compete against, but as an opportunity to help us like bring that scale to the women's game.
Well, as you say, a lot of partners and brands actually are looking for the men's counterpart as well to be part of that package at the moment, perhaps. So
yeah, and that's a really important point as well, and that's something that we just need to be careful about. Like within this next iteration of our strategy is we have got a few brands and partners waking up and being like, oh, we need to make sure that we have the women's rights, and I'm like, that's cool, but pay for them. Like, let's make sure we realise that value. So if you pay,
is it getting easier to? We talked about sort of attributing value to commercial deals, but is it getting easier to say what that amount is? Because
I think it's an art and a science. I don't know. I think there are some stats and data that you can put behind it, and that's what I would say is we're very aware of that, and I'm very aware of that, and I want to make sure that we are being very clear on what the data is that can go into it. So your traditional metrics around audience, eyeballs on TV, attendances, etc., and sort of the media value that brings. But the bit that I'm interested in, and this is where the sort of the art comes in, is like definitely from something like the 100. We talk about the men's game bringing the scale, but the women's game within that competition, it brings the soul, it brings the purpose, and its purpose can be seen as a bit of a like CSR word and a bit of not a dirty word, but just a bit sort of a throwaway. Women's sport brings purpose. It's more than that.
Yeah. Well,
it's relevant.
It's a really interesting point, isn't it? Because purpose, presumably, Anmol is something that you really sort of look at, and in terms of your storytelling and content generation, but sort of aligning with all of those fantastic values and visions that women's sport has and is becoming known for. Is that something that's sort of key to?
Yeah, 100%. And I think, you kind of said it well in our side too. We think that traditional media covers things a certain way, and historically, it's stuff on the field, right? It's highlights, it's goals, it's dunks, it's touchdowns, where we love covering the stuff off the field. So, the pregame, the postgame, what are they wearing? What are they doing for their community? How's their family life? That sort of stuff we think kind of resonates with the casual fan. And, for our platform, there are so many places to watch highlights for all of your amazing properties. There's so many places you can kind of follow the sport. But if you're a casual fan and you don't know that the World Cup starts in a couple of weeks, you don't know the Wimbledon is going on today, you don't know who LeBron James is or Serena Williams is, right? We use our platform to help kind of capture that curiosity of that person and kind of get them to, we kind of call it like appetizers to the meal, right? So we get them a little bit to kind of come in more and, try and resonate with things that people can relate to, which is the pregame of an NFL game, the tailgate, right? Which is kind of the fan experience beyond it, which is the community aspect that you kind of mentioned. So the values and the purpose are very, very important to us. And for us too, we believe that actually brings us to a much wider set of potential fans and users. And going back to our first point, really our goal for any league broadcaster rights holder is to attract that new fan. So it's very, very, very critical to us to make sure we're doing stuff that's not just highlights and goals and stuff on the field.
And Belinda, is that something that's on your mind, is sort of the rebrand of PWR has now taken place, but in terms of growing that fan base, and it will, the elephant in the room is, of course, men's rugby is in quite a difficult position itself, and we've seen some casualties over the last 12 months, and it must be on your mind as well to try and build a sustainable, financially secure environment for women's rugby going forward? Is that sort of growth piece and potentially securing a key media rights deal, for example, is that sort of top of the priority list?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's undoubtedly been a really tough few months in the men's game, and I think, what we can do though is focus on where we are, and exactly as you said, try and make sure that the league is sustainable. To that end, we have a remuneration cap, not a salary cap in women's rugby. So our players are mainly dual career players, with the exception of some of the Red Roses, and that means they're juggling work and their rugby. But where we are right now, we need to try and ensure that it's competitive on the field. So that's another reason for the REM cap, is that it levels that playing field as much as you can ever do that. And that then means the scores are hopefully closer, the matches are more contested, and therefore from a broadcast point of view, it becomes a more engaging property. So there's lots of spin-offs, if you like, from making it financially sustainable, which is fundamentally important to make sure that we have longevity of the game, but also to make it something that's appealing to commercial partners and broadcasters as well. So absolutely at the heart of what we're doing at the minute, but it's not easy. It really isn't.
And when you look at sort of the makeup of the clubs that are participating in the PWR, how important is that commitment to investment, as opposed to, say, player pathway, infrastructure, access to venue, the participation and licensing criteria that clubs have to satisfy? Can you rank them, or are they all equally important, do you think?
I think it's interesting. I think none of them are particularly doing it the same way in terms of how they set their women's side of the club up. So you've got, if you like, Worcester Women, who are a standalone company. You've got Ealing Trailfinders, who are part of a championship set up at Ealing. And then as you say, the others are part of either university partnerships. We've got, as you mentioned earlier, Gloucester Hartbury and Loughborough and Northampton. So lots of different models within the sport, which I think is interesting. I think there's lots, as you say, there's lots of criteria that make this add up. The minimum operating standards have gone up considerably this season. We expect a lot of our clubs to make this work going forward, and that's particularly around the give back to players, so around medical, around that support for S&C, that sort of more professional environment around the players, which I think is that all those building blocks towards a more professional league, and I think those are key. So I think it's difficult to rank. I think I'll avoid doing that. I'll fall out with someone at that rate. But
no, I thought you might. That's fine. Kelly, I saw you scribbling down. Have you got anything that you'd like to say on what's already been said, or I was going to ask you about the Sweet Media deal, but do you want to say anything first?
It's the brain fog. I'm writing everything down.
I
just what Beth said really about, you go to these events and you read stuff on social media, and people expect women's sport to be profitable straight away, and without investment up front. And it's like any other startup, it needs investment in the quality of the product, it needs investment in marketing, and both have spoken about the importance of investing in the product and the high performance environment to create the best spectacle ultimately to then go and market it. And women's sport has just been massively underinvested. So I think the whole sort of investment up ahead of revenue piece and private equity in that is just a sort of an interesting piece. But no, do ask me about media rights.
Well, now you've brought up investment, I'll come back to media rights, because we're seeing, I'd say, sort of an increasing number of funds or investors that are specifically looking at and targeting women's sport. And obviously Angel City has come up. We know the guys at Angel City very well, and obviously that's a totally different model. Anmol, you'll sort of recognise that from the US as a closed franchise league, so potentially more attractive. But where do you think the opportunities are to sort of invest ahead of time? Because for women's football, for example, the vast majority of the women's teams are integrated with their men's, and often the case, EPL team. Can you see there sort of being investment at club level? Or I know you've obviously been through the process of private equity investment at league level. That might not totally be off the table. Maybe you could let us know. But yeah.
Yeah, well, I think let's start centrally. So we have had approaches on private equity. You can probably read them in the paper. I'm probably not allowed to say what they are, so read the papers because they got leaked. But I think ultimately our first approach, we hadn't even done the first media rights, still very, very difficult to value what the WSL and the Championship is going to be worth in that context when you're just starting out. And also I think you've got to be really clear what investment you need, which is part of the next iteration of the league coming out, the new team building the next phase of the strategy, really understanding what investment is needed, and therefore how are you going to get that investment? Are the clubs able to step in? Are football stakeholders able to step in? Or do you need private equity to absolutely sort of realise its fullest potential? Those are the debates, I think, for Newco down the line. So I wouldn't say it's sort of ever off the table. There are club opportunities in independent clubs. There's also, potential partnerships with women's sections as wholly owned subsidiaries, if you like. I think we haven't seen that in this country yet, but Michelle Kang, who bought Washington, has bought, I think she's a majority stakeholder now in Olympique Lyonnais, so it's sort of possible, and it's an interesting one, I think. But if you look at the sort of Deloitte's report that came out in terms of football, there's still a significant contribution, albeit that is coming down from the overall club as women's football revenues grow. So I guess, ultimately that's a decision for each club to think through whether they're prepared to invest up front ahead of revenue or want to get in support and investment. But with that, you can bring in massive expertise, but you can lose controls as well.
Yeah, it's that fine balance, isn't it? And a lot of people get welded to a certain percentage equity that they're giving away, whereas actually a lot of that can be controlled contractually. But you are potentially bringing in an expert, but another person around the table regardless. Anmol, it was interesting because when Nike announced that they'd taken equity in the WNBA, apologies, that sort of made me sort of really think, because what Nike are trying to do with basketball in the US around content creation, storytelling, and that they took an equity stake to hopefully complement their work there. Is that ever something that Snap might entertain, or it's quite an interesting model, I thought, for a brand to be a shareholder.
It's super interesting, and to your point, I think Nike has ingrained themselves in many sports, but basketball being kind of the primary one in the US with the NBA and WNBA, so it makes a ton of sense. And as everyone knows here, like, they sign players out of college when they get drafted, so they have a huge tie to the league and to players from day one. I wouldn't say today, but I'll never say never for anything on our platform. I've been there long enough where things change. What I will say is we believe that given our current tool set, we can develop deep relationships and partnerships with leagues, broadcasters and rights holders, teams and athletes based on our platform, right? So if you think about how we work with somebody, use WNBA for example, our future goal set with them, we have the league relationship, so we get access to IP rights, highlights, anything with the league directly, right? If you want to do events with them, showcase our platform with them together. The broadcaster, so ESPN's a major broadcaster in the US, so same level there, right? Content from the broadcasting standpoint. The teams, a lot of the teams now have dedicated Snapchat accounts. As much as we love the leagues, the teams can do a lot more flexibility and be a lot more fun with stuff on social especially. So that really helps us kind of push forward some of our products, some of our initiatives, than the players. So I think through those 5 or 6 initiatives, we can develop really, really comprehensive 360 relationships and accomplish the goal of getting ingrained with the league through our kind of tool set. And maybe one day when we're working with the league in a big way, in the same way that Nike kind of has, where they have it kind of soup to nuts, we can do more. But we feel very confident that right now we have plenty of tools to have deep relationships with our partners.
Yeah. We've talked quite a bit about sort of women's sport being integrated with men's sport. Beth, have you started to consider ever like a standalone women's sport property, or because obviously we've seen the women's IPL, really be a case study for women's sport as to the types of values that teams can sell for and the attention that can be drawn up. Is that something that is on the radar or that you've been thinking about?
Yeah, look, I think it's something that we're looking at through this work that we're doing around our new women's pro-game strategy. I think it is difficult in this market, in this country, for women's cricket to do that. I think the WPL, so the Women's Premier League in India, has been incredible in terms of what that's done around the sort of the ecosystem for women's cricket commercials. So that is a standalone property, and that works in India because cricket it's almost like a religion out there, actually. So we've seen the enormous revenues that's brought in through media rights deal and the sale of the 5 teams. But yeah, look, we're looking at it. I think the way that we position cricket in this country, I've already touched on it, is very much that kind of trying to have that co-positioning of the men and the women alongside each other. And I think that is incredibly powerful. I think what we've launched in the last few years through the 100. So that's our new 8-team city-based competition. So it's 100-ball cricket that we launched in 2021. 8 new brands, a lot of data and research and insight went into the development of those brands as to what was like culturally relevant within those cities. So they are gender-neutral brands, very much created to have the men and the women together. And I think that is incredibly powerful. I know that definitely as a parent to 2 young children. So I have a boy and a girl, and when I can take them to a match day at the 100, and that they can aspire to play for that same team one day, I think that is a real sort of powerful statement for where we are. So I think for cricket right now in the UK, across England and Wales, I think there's going to be probably more alignment actually between the men's and the women's moving forwards. But that isn't to say that we're going to close off opportunities. So I'm pretty sure if Cara Nortman or somebody gave me a call tomorrow and said that they'd like to invest in women's cricket in this country, I'd take that call. But to what Kelly says, you have to sort of go into those conversations with your eyes wide open as to what that could mean down the line. So nothing is off the table. But I think at the moment we're going down a more closely aligned route for cricket because of that gender balanced presentation of the sport that we want to see.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because that also appeals, doesn't it, to some investors, is that it can have parity, and that's ultimately what we're all, I think, in this room striving for. Okay, Kelly, I'm going to mention the media rights deal because I think we've obviously talked about investment is required, money up front ahead of the curve is required. Media rights, sort of all the rights that leagues can sell, is obviously sort of top of the pile. And a couple of years ago, when the FA announced the deal with the BBC and Sky to show the WSL, so it was described as a landmark deal. You'll be able to tell me, but I think it was reported as £8 million a year. I think the FA are in the process or soon to be going out to market for the next rights cycle. How do you expect things to change this time around? I know you might not necessarily be sort of at the helm or heavily involved, but what would you like to see? We've talked before, you and I, about sort of 3 p.m. matches, etc., and removing that blackout for women's football. Tell us sort of what you see the future and how critical a media rights deal is to the success of a league.
Well, I mean, it's hugely critical in terms of building audience and revenue, key revenue streams, and men's football's built really on media rights, men's professional game. So last time out, we had a conversation early doors as a board and prioritised reach over revenue because we're in that phase of building awareness and building engagement, and we felt that, and we deliberately sort of went out to try and get a free-to-air and a pay-per-view partnership and structured the packages to do that, and we're absolutely delighted, obviously, to get BBC and Sky. My personal view, as having sort of 2 days into having stepped away, although I'm still there at the moment supporting, but stepping away from it, so it will be, the new regime driving the deal, but obviously with Dawn, who's pivotal, our chair, who's a media rights expert at the helm. But my personal view, I still think need to really think about that reach, as well as obviously trying to drive revenue. It was a landmark deal. Obviously, look at the EFL's deal. Obviously, they've delivered a lot more live games for that big uplift. But in terms of our Sky audiences at the moment, we've got bigger averages than EFL and Scottish Premier League. So it's kind of like, ultimately the price piece will obviously come down to the competition in the market. That's what will drive the price. And then there's ways, for the broadcast subgroup who are overseeing it to think about, is there more access? Are there sort of documentary series? How are we going to try and are we going to deliver? Are we going to put more live games out? Or how are we going to try and sort of drive up the value? And all of that, is sort of being worked through. And at the moment, obviously, Pitch who are here, there they are, Pitch, have been selling our overseas rights, and we've got a fabulous sort of network of territories across the world that WSL is being delivered in. But that all comes sort of up at the same time. So a real opportunity, I think, to sort of go test the market and see how through the significant growth and the big audiences that we've delivered to date, obviously with room for much room for further growth, what that means in the market. But I still think reach is as important as revenue at this stage.
And Belinda, PWR, Premiership Women's Rugby, announced last week, of course, that you were partnering to sort of go out for your media rights. Do you sort of endorse what Kelly is saying there about reach over revenue and, how critical the media rights deal will be for women's rugby?
Yeah, completely. That reach is fundamentally important. We're much smaller than you are, and we need to get people to see it. So yeah, that ability to be on a free-to-air channel where you can be easily found. And I think that's probably our biggest play for this time round. BBC have been incredibly supportive, but we've often been on the red button, and that's just that little bit harder for viewers to find. So I think the priority is to work with free-to-air channels, but to find a slot that we can make work so that we're more easy to find. And I was talking to a player a few weeks ago, and it was a Thursday, and she said, do you know if we're on TV this week? I'm like, well, if the players don't know if we're on TV, then there's very little chance the fans do. So I think that's making sure that we signpost it well, that we make it more clear to our fans, and that's a really key part of growing our audience. So yeah, it's the number one thing on the table at the moment.
Because I think it's really interesting that, Anmol, you mentioned earlier the sort of terminology of a casual fan. And I think that is true. I see that in women's sport. I see that as different to men's sport, where you just want to watch good women athletes playing sport and you're not necessarily aligned to a team, or you haven't grown up as a generational fan of a team. Is there a way that sort of brands like Snap can sort of target those casual fans and say pull them in so that you at least can then signpost them onto linear TV, for example, in terms of that's where the matches are shown?
Yeah, definitely. So I think when we think about, I'll use myself as an example, right? I'm a hardcore sports fan, grew up outside New York City. So no matter who's on the team, I'm a diehard Knicks, Rangers, Yankees, and Giants fan, no matter how good or bad they are. For the young person, the teenager, right, to your point, they now follow individuals more versus maybe teams. They don't have local alliances. They might follow a certain player because of different reasons, maybe some on the court, off the pitch, on the pitch. So I think it's really, really important that we all recognize that with young fans today. Like the way that we sort of grew up sitting on our couches and watching 3 or 4 hours of a football match or an NFL game is not really happening for a teenager today. And I don't know how many people in this room have teenage kids. Raise your hand if you do. All right, good amount. So, one stat we like to say, which is a funny one, the average attention span for a teenager is 8 seconds. The average attention span,
long?
Yeah, which is crazy. The average attention span for a goldfish is 9 seconds. So, our goal on Snap is to capture that small time period you have. And in all seriousness, when we think about our experience watching sports for all of us in this room with the remote control on your couch, the young person's remote control now is their phone, right? So they have a million apps, many different ways they can kind of consume and create content. That optionality has never been higher. And because of that, it's super important to make sure you have sort of dynamic, engaging, fun, informative, entertaining content to reel them in. And like you said, to get them to the point where they're going to games, they're buying merch, they're buying tickets, they're kind of watching on TV, all kind of the revenue-driving pieces. It really starts with small ideas to capture the attention of these people at a young age.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and there'll be people in the room that are in the process of creating novel ticketing strategies or merchandising to sort of appeal to this bespoke, unique, in some ways, women's sport fan. Well, I think we're sort of nearing the end of our discussion, but I just wanted to finish with some fun, hopefully, maybe for the audience, let's say the panellists, some quick fire questions, and I'd just like a yes or a no, and then I was thinking about it on my way in. I thought I'll give you a maybe as well. Okay, so Beth, we've perhaps actually covered this before, but so I think we know the answer. But do you see a women's Premier League in England in the future?
I think the answer is no. As a standalone property, but I do think we will see a much bigger profile around our domestic T20 comps in the future, very much so.
Great. We look forward to that. Kelly, my question to you is, do you see the future of the WSL, just the WSL, as a closed franchise league?
Nope.
Yeah. Anmol, sorry. My question for you is, do you ever, or can you predict that traditional broadcasting of sport, sitting down for an hour and a half, 2 hours watching sport, will be replaced in the future by some other digital means?
I don't think it'll be replaced. It'll be complemented in a big way. I think people will still want to watch the biggest games on the biggest screen, but to engage around it and talk to friends will always, the social aspect will always grow for the next couple of years, for sure.
Yes or no?
Or maybe.
I can't predict it, but my
all
guess is
You
that
can have
it'll
maybe.
grow. Yes,
You can maybe. And Belinda, finally, how crucial will the success of the Roses, so the England national team, women's team, be to support the development and growth of PWR?
I think it'll be crucial. Hugely crucial.
So bring on the World Cup, as you say. We're very much looking forward to hosting that. And
Yeah, it'll be
seeing all the
amazing.
action.
It'll be amazing. And fingers crossed.
Yeah. Well, I think we can go one better than in New Zealand. So let's have it. Fantastic. Well, look, we've got sort of 5-10 minutes now before we sort of break away back into networking for any questions as we were going through. If people have burning questions for the panel, then please do raise your hand and we'll bring a mic over.
Make sure that nobody's left behind in the manner that they have been in men's sport.
Yes, I think, look, from a cricket perspective, we're trying to make sure from a pathway element that our pathways are as accessible and inclusive as possible. It's something, we had a report released last week, the Independent Commission into Equity in Cricket, which really highlighted some of the historic discrimination that's gone on within cricket from sort of a race, a gender and a class perspective. So, look, I think it's something we're incredibly aware of. We do have an ambition to be the UK's most inclusive sport, and that's everything from participation through the pathways into the professional game. I think new products such as the 100s, like a really key purpose of the 100 from a fan perspective is to really throw cricket's doors open to more people, trying to have accessible ticket pricing, for example, trying to have a product that people want to engage with. So I think it's just being like really clear on what we can do at each level of the game. And I think just recognising some of the historic disparity that's in place will hopefully enable us to approach that in a more equitable way moving forwards.
Yeah, similar in football. The real focus at the moment on making sure that the pathway is more diverse. We've launched emerging talent centres across the country to widen the base, make sure that they're in the hearts of the communities across the country to be more accessible, and Discover My Talent, where girls playing in different sort of community activities, mixed football, etc., can be nominated and identified in our talent pathway, and that's already having significant gains in terms of diversifying the England youth teams. Whereas sort of our fan base with the pricing point, it tends to be sort of a younger, more diverse fan base, but definitely work to do around the pathway.
And that sounds just like the audience that Snap is attracting as well, is that young, diverse fan. So,
Yeah, so I mean, we have nearly 400 million daily active users on our platform. A little over half are females, and our core demographic is 13 to 24. So everything you put on our platform has to reach our audience. So it's very, very important to us. And this is the reason why we're leading, obviously, significantly in the women's sports side, but also just broadly to your question, really everyone. We want to make sure anyone who joins Snap, there's something for them between friends, content, creative tools to make sure that we're catering their needs on our platform.
here, Felicity, with the lady with the sort of brown top on. Thanks.
Thanks for that. That was wicked, really interesting. So just a bit, probably a more general question, but I'll point it at Anmol to kick off with. We hear a lot on some amazing points around doing women's sport differently. We're down to the same as the bloke sport. We can do things differently, slightly blank sheet of paper, but not completely. From your approach to brands and sports, how have you adapted what Snap does to cater for a female audience as opposed to male? Because again, loads of people will jump on the bandwagon, not saying that you are, but some brands, people in this place to capitalise on what women's sport is doing and that growth, but really learning about the demographic and the market differently. What have you learned operating in women's sport that's different? And then potentially to yourselves in the panellist, what have you learned from maybe doing things a little bit differently for women's sport?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll start actually with a point that you made earlier. I think there's three key goals for any league broadcaster rights holder: driving reach, driving relevance, driving revenue. So ultimately, we have to back into those three things to make any sort of relevance on our platform for women's sport, men's sports, really anything. So when we think about our partnerships, our goal is to always set up a foundation to drive those three pillars. And you said this earlier, like in some cases, some come after the other, right? So reach comes first, maybe revenue comes second, but being relevant is super, super important. So what we're trying to do, and you mentioned earlier too, Harriet, women's sport is so unique. And I use this example a lot in the US. If we were sitting in a bar or restaurant and Christian Pulisic walked through, I don't think anyone knows who he is. You guys might know than he is than people in the US, candidly, obviously because he plays here. If Megan Rapinoe and Alex Morgan walked through the bar, every single person would turn around and try and get a picture, right? So the reason why is because they've used platforms like ours and others to really showcase a lot of things off the field and what they're really doing in their communities. And they're so well known, their fight for equal pay and pieces like that. So we're covering stories like that I think are, again, relevant to a much wider set of people as opposed to just what's happening on the field. And that's really been our focus in this vertical and kind of new verticals, where how do you kind of capture the people that don't necessarily know everything about the sport today, and to your point, there's not like years of fandom really bought in just yet, but can relate to fun, entertaining, and engaging content. So I think the one thing you'll see if you use our platform, hopefully everyone here uses our platform, is it's really, really fun. So that's kind of the thing that we try to bring to our user base, and really for young people, for them to keep them engaged and keep their attention span, focused on us. It's really finding those kind of tools to make sure they can talk to their best friends and family every single day around this.
We've got a question just, with the long dark hair just behind you, Felicity, about 4 rows back. Thank you. It's very difficult to see, by the way, out here because the lights are very bright. Yeah.
I'm trying to hold my hands tall, really. Thank you so much for the panel. And my question is to really all of you. I think if we look at sports traditionally, in men's sports, I mean, it's great, but there's problems. For example, the more commercialized the sports is, I mean, we see mental health and well-being problems with the players. And as a women professional sports is just in infancy, blank canvas, I think it's a great opportunity. And my question is really, while the women professional sports are growing and being commercialized, how do you ensure, the players' well-being and the mental health and their personal development are at the heart of the development, the sports? Thank you.
It's a great question. Do you want me to? I don't mind kicking off in that we've got a real focus at the moment. We've just appointed a player care person. We've got licence criteria in the clubs around player welfare, player care. We did a deep dive after what happened in the NWSL and other horrible stories across the world in women's football, real deep dive into welfare. But I think, it starts obviously in the academies, making sure that players have got all of the support they need in terms of not just sort of mental well-being, but we're a dual career sport ultimately, so making sure they've got the right education support, whole range of sort of services that they need, right through to coming out, and they'll probably need a job at the end because they're not Premier League footballers, retiring. So the whole sort of post-career support. So we're just looking at that whole sort of end-to-end spectrum of what do players need to support them and develop them and make it the best environment possible. And obviously through that, bringing out the best in them as players as well.
Yeah, and similar to you, we our minimum operating standards have player welfare at the heart of that, and players obviously at the core of everything we do. But we also work really closely, and Polly's here, with the Women's Rugby Players Association and the Rugby Players Association, as well as the two unions. We spend a lot of time talking to them and building those relationships to make sure we are getting the right support out to players. So they play a key part in it too.
Yeah, that's similar. We work very closely with the Professional Cricketers Associations, the PCA, and each of our professional women's teams have a PDM, so personal development manager, I think, attached to them. So they have that support. And I also know through the central funding model that we have at the moment, we've just significantly increased the level into psych and sports psych to make sure each of the teams have dedicated support in that space. Because I think it is a really important area. Like, women's sport is professionalising so quickly, and the scrutiny it's all of a sudden there at a level that it never has been. So I think we'd all agree that it's a fundamental thing that we need to make sure we get right.
Thanks, guys. I think we've got time for maybe 2 more. So there's a lady at the front here.
Hiya guys. There was a really interesting report this morning from Women's Sport Trust, and it actually flagged new brands to sport entirely are making huge impact, which is obviously really makes my heart sing. I guess for you guys, for your respective sports, what's the opportunity there? And are you proactively going after new brands as well as sort of long-term sponsors?
Have you read the whole report already, Jenny? That's very impressive.
I'm not that quick.
I've read the press
I was
release.
going to say, I read the press bit on the way here.
Yeah, look, I mean, we're always looking for new brands. I think similar, yeah, it made my heart sing. It's like I immediately forwarded it onto our commercial team because it's something, something that I'm acutely aware of is, you know, especially cricket, we've got a very sort of traditional set of partners that we work with in our traditional formats. Again, going back to the 100, I think that gives us a new opportunity to reach new brands and to work with brands that are going to help us reach a new audience as well. And look, I think we've talked about sort of the model that we have at the moment with the men's and the women's game. Like, it is a bundled model, but we're looking at ways that we can pull out women's specific rights and potentially go after those new brands and partners. And look, the good thing about that as well is that'll be incremental new value, right? New money. It's not just sort of cyclical. So yeah, I think it's really exciting. I think it's a great report. I know Chris Hurst is in the room somewhere as well. So thank you for helping to pull that together.
Okay, one last question. The lady there with her hand up.
Hiya. As you've said, you know, none of the women's players from cricket, rugby or football will retire on a pile of coins and gold. So I was wondering, with the news yesterday that the FA won't be giving bonuses to the women's players for the World Cup, they've said that, you know, the one given by FIFA is enough, despite the fact, you know, FIFA have said it's base level. I wonder what the rationale was for that, with, you know, their commercial opportunities limited completely as of tomorrow.
Yeah, this is going to be a real ducking because I don't actually work with England, so I'm not involved at all in the negotiations. As I understand it, the FIFA, instead of giving the money to the federations, who then give the money to England, have agreed allocations directly to all players, so that every player or collection of players then have to negotiate with each individual federation across the world. And you can imagine how ranging in success that method is. So I believe it's sort of more of a sort of replacement line, a funnel, a change in funnel. But ultimately, I run the WSL, or did run the WSL in the Championship till 2 days ago. So I'm not involved in that. But as I understand it, it's a significant uplift on previous deals.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I hope you really enjoyed that. We certainly did. I'd like to just hand over to Kate Bosworth now, just say a few closing remarks.
Hey, if Carlsberg did panels, eh? Thank you very much for joining us this morning. And it's great to pass the moderating mic over to you today, Harriet. You did an absolutely sterling job. Big round of applause. I just wanted to explain a little bit about our objectives for today. So I think, like many of the panel, I've sat on countless women's sport panels and I've answered the same questions again and again, and the conversation seems to be sort of going round in circles. So our objective today was to try and progress that conversation, whether that be on a legislative, regulatory, strategic, commercial basis. You know, when the women's sports sector is changing to this degree, you know, that acceleration of professionalisation, etc., we do need to drive the narrative forward. And we'd hope that today will be perhaps one of the first of a series of panels that do this. We take our responsibility at Onside Law to take the narrative forward very seriously. So hopefully this will be the first of many. So thank you all very much for coming this morning and taking time out of your busy diaries. Good luck, Belinda, Beth, Kelly, enjoy your slightly slowing down summer that you're about to enjoy. Anmol, thanks very much for joining us as well. Hopefully we shall see you all at the next one. Have a great day. Thank you very much.